Okay, so I stopped sharing. Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to see you. I believe we'll have some more people still joining us, but I think we should get started because we have a very busy program today. So good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, wherever you are. And thank you for joining us for the launch of the book Modern Slavery and the Governance of Global Value Chains as part of the Change Lab Collaboratory. So this book is the product of many years of collaboration, interdisciplinary dialogue, and a deep engagement with the structural conditions that sustain severe exploitation in today's global economy. I am going to open with a little bit of an introduction to the book, and then we're going to have Tamar Barkay, the co-editor of the book, sharing the 4 papers who are going to be presented, and then the Q&A. So let me again share screen, and then we can start. Okay. So can you see my screen? Is everything working? Yeah, okay. So let's start. Okay, so I want to say that on a personal note, this book has been the product of my own research journey as well in the past many years. It began in my first ERC project, TrafLab, where we worked on conceptualizing and developing a labor approach to human trafficking. And in that project, we examined the root causes of severe labor market exploitation and challenged the dominant international response, which treated trafficking as an individualized criminal problem rather than a structural one. During TrafLab, kind of Tamar, I must say, nudged me in that direction. I also began turning towards global value chains, a direction inspired partly by new transparency laws emerging in California, UK, Australia, later HRDD legislation in Europe. And these laws prompted corporations to examine their supply chains, and they prompted us to begin a follow the money analysis to ask how multinational corporations create, sustain, or could prevent modern slavery through their governance of supply chains. The final stage of the research and kind of the synthesis that shaped this book were carried out under my current ERC project, Change Lab, where we broadened our inquiry to the governance, law, and political economy of global value chains. I'll say that another building block of this book was the community of scholars who joined us at our 2019 New Delhi conference and then a 2021 online workshop. These events brought together researchers from the global north and global south across law, sociology, anthropology, geography, economics. And the dialogue that unfolded in those meetings, look how young we were, shaped the architecture of the book and its interdisciplinary character. So the book was written over many years, during which we lived through a global pandemic, a war in Ukraine, an ongoing war and violence in Israel and Gaza. During this period, we also experienced a profound personal loss. Our dear friend and co-editor, Bimal Arora, passed away in 2022, and Varsha Joshi, one of our contributors, passed away in 2020. We dedicate this book to their memory. And I want to take this opportunity to thank my co-editor in this long journey, Shilpi, Banerjee, and Tamar Barkay. I'll say that Tamar joined us after Bimal passed away, and without her energy and dedication, really, we could not have completed this work. So thank you, Tamar. I also want to thank Jade Koch for her work in the early stages of the book, and then Debbie Seaton for supporting the editing and production of the chapters, Amanda Dale, an editor who worked closely with several authors, and of course, thank you to the editors of the Development Trajectories in GVC's series in CUP for believing in the project, and particularly to Dev Nathan, who initiated the idea of the book, and to Anrisha Rana at the CUP and her whole team for their support and their patience. Above all, of course, we thank all the contributors. Their scholarship, fieldwork, insights is what made this book what it is and made it possible. So our starting point for the book is the global attempt to combat human trafficking, right? This, as you saw in the first poster, in the 2019 poster, it was GVCs and human trafficking. Legally, trafficking evolved through 2 generations of instruments, early 20th century white slave traffic conventions, and then the 2000 trafficking protocol and what came in its aftermath, with its definition of trafficking around wide elements of acts, means, and purpose. That definition, however, as we all know, is open-ended and contributed to measurement difficulties and conceptual fragmentation in the field. The vagueness of the definition made trafficking extremely difficult to measure and address, and global actors therefore shifted from trying to kind of address only trafficking as a phenomenon and identifying victims of trafficking to estimating the prevalence of what was now called modern slavery. And the book title changed with the editor's request from us to move to modern slavery, an idea of a broader conceptual umbrella encompassing trafficking, forced labor, bonded labor, servitude, and other slavery-like practices. The term also gained traction because it was adopted into national legislation, such as the UK and Australian Modern Slavery Act, and accepted increasingly in UN bodies, and disallowed policymakers and researchers to sidestep definitional battles and instead focus on the structural conditions underlying severe exploitation. The shift toward modern slavery therefore reflects a deeper analytical shift, away from exceptionalist narratives of crime and rescue and towards understanding of exploitation as a continuum embedded in labor market and global supply chains. I'll say that's the charitable reading of modern slavery. Some will say it actually pushed it towards a more criminal direction, but let's stick with the charitable one now. So despite enormous global commitments, sorry, I'm muting Fernanda. Despite enormous global commitments and resources, the traditional human rights-based or criminal law-based approach to trafficking model has proved largely ineffective, right? And the identification rates remain extremely low, prosecution remains minimal, modern slavery numbers actually continue to rise. They're not decreasing despite all of this that's happening. The international response therefore offered an important puzzle. Why do impressive-looking efforts fail to address the phenomenon? And it's in this context that we did our work at TrafLab around the conceptualization of a labor approach to reframe the problem of trafficking from one of criminal law to one of structural causes. So for over 2 decades, the dominant international response to trafficking and modern slavery has been organized around what is known as the 3 Ps: prevention, protection, and prosecutions. States criminalized trafficking, tightened border controls in the name of prevention, and offered ex post assistance to a very small number of identified victims. At TrafLab, we worked on developing a 4th piece of the puzzle, right? A labor approach, one that doesn't treat trafficking as an exceptional crime committed by deviant individuals, but rather sees trafficked persons seeing trafficking as a structural phenomenon. So the labor approach to trafficking understands the phenomena not as an isolated criminal act, but as escalated forms of labor exploitation produced by structural power imbalances in labor markets. So this approach emphasizes workers' agency, collective organization, labor rights, and reforms that rebalance bargaining power. It moves from ex post rescue to ex ante structural change, targeting the economic and legal conditions that produce vulnerability, and therefore aims not to remove workers from employment relationships, but to transform those relationships so workers can renegotiate their conditions rather than be rescued into precarity. So this was one key conceptual move that leads the book. The second is a key conceptual move that animates the book is the development approach articulated by Prabha Koteswaran. This approach asks us to look at the root causes in developing countries, to poverty, underdevelopment, lack of social protections in the global south, which shape workers' vulnerability before they ever enter a supply chain, right? It critiques the assumption that improving labor regulation alone can reach the most vulnerable, many of whom work informally or outside legal protection. So together, the labor and development approaches argue that modern slavery arises from structural, socioeconomic, and legal systems, not isolated crime. They highlight a continuum of vulnerability and insist that effective interventions must address the institutions and markets and laws that shape workers' degree of freedom. But as we argue in the book, these approaches originally didn't fully address the organization of global value chains, where corporate practices and supply chain structure also generate vulnerability. So the book builds on these frameworks and expands them into the GVC domain. So over the last decade, these two fields, modern slavery and GVC governance, have converged in some ways. Modern slavery policy and global value chain governance convergence emerged from the recognition that the dominant anti-trafficking paradigm failed to reduce exploitation, and that the organization of supply chains themselves plays a decisive role in producing or mitigating modern slavery. Research shows that lead firms, even when legally distant, exert enormous influence through purchasing practices, production timelines, and price pressures. These dynamics can generate exploitative conditions throughout their supplier networks. And in other words, modern slavery is structurally embedded in GVCs, and this is what the book tries to unpack. As these insights took hold, activists, unions, policymakers, scholars began to view corporations not merely as bystanders, but as central actors whose governance of supply chains shapes workers' vulnerability. This led to proliferation of governance initiatives, right, of corporate-driven CSR, state-driven transparency and HRDD legislation, and all sorts of worker-driven approaches like global framework agreements and enforceable brand agreements, the Fair Food Program, Bangladesh Accord as examples. Yet research also shows the limits of these initiatives, right? CSR often relies on goodwill. Transparency and HRDD tend to depend on market enforcement as well. And even the worker-driven model, WSR models, while highly promising, face challenges of scalability and sustainability. The convergence between modern slavery and GVC governance, therefore, marks a deeper analytical shift, right? Modern slavery is not external to the global economy. It is produced by the way the global economy is organized. Addressing it requires transforming supply chain governance itself. And this is the challenge that the book tries again to unpack. Okay, let me just move to this. So right, the challenges of seeing lead firms and corporate actors as responsible and act against their role in modern slavery stems from the patterns and logic of global value chains. So the logic of value chains is basically cost pressures, right? The squeeze suppliers and push exploitation downwards. Yet we have these governance gaps that create space for abuse without liability, and we have difficulties in attributing liability to lead firms whose decisions profoundly affect labor conditions. Okay, I think I've already covered this, so let me move quickly to just say the key insights from the book, and then we will move to our speakers. So this book advances 4 central insights that emerge when modern slavery research is brought into sustained conversation with global value chains analysis. First, we highlight the crucial role of law, understood broadly across public, private, domestic, and transnational layers, in shaping the structures and distributive outcomes of GVCs. Law not only enables current patterns of outsourcing and fragmented production, but can also, in principle, be mobilized to transform them. The chapters in part 1, we'll hear 2 of these today, reveal how transparency and due diligence laws, trade bans, and reporting mechanisms can reconfigure information flows and power relations within chains, while also exposing the limits of these tools when they rely heavily on corporate goodwill or market discipline alone. Second, we foreground the actors who populate and contest GVCs, lead firms, suppliers, workers, unions, recruiters, NGOs, auditors, other intermediaries. Modern slavery cannot be understood without mapping how these actors interact within the chain, where power is concentrated, and how governance efforts reproduce or challenge existing hierarchies. So part 2 of the book shows how corporate governance norms, recruitment systems, private compliance markets shape working conditions, and how alternative models, especially worker-driven ones, seek to rebalance power from below. And we'll hear one chapter from this part of the book. Third, the book demonstrates the importance of contextual sectoral analysis. Severe exploitation is not uniform across industries. Through detailed studies of sugarcane cutting, sex work, construction, garment production in India, Part 3 shows how local histories, caste, gender dynamics, informality, and production arrangements mediate how global pressures translate into labor conditions on the ground. These chapters underline that effective governance must be sensitive to sector-specific vulnerabilities. Finally, the book insists that any meaningful analysis of modern slavery and GVCs must contend with the deep entanglement between the formal and informal economy. Although GVC governance frameworks typically focus on formal suppliers, much of the labor that sustains these chains takes place in the informal, unregulated, and invisible spaces. Ignoring informality obscures the mechanisms by which exploitation is displaced downward and outward. The book therefore calls for theoretical and regulatory innovations that can reach the fuzzy ends of supply chains where many of the most vulnerable workers are located. So together, these insights push the field beyond narrow criminal law responses and beyond voluntary corporate commitments towards a richer, more structural understanding of how modern slavery is produced and how it might be dismantled within the architecture of global value chains. The book, as I said, has 3 parts. Part 1 examines the legal frameworks. Part 2 examines actors, and Part 3 dives into the sectors. Today, we will hear 2 chapters from Part 1, 1 from Part 2, and 1 from Part 3. I want to thank the contributors who are willing to come here and present their chapters, and I will now turn to Dr. Tamar Barkay, my co-editor and friend, who will launch our round of presentations.
Thank you, Hila.